Hello, festive soul on the search for a cookie recipe. I'm so glad you arrived. Take a seat and I'll tell you a little bit about this recipe. Once upon a time, there stood a castle. This castle had a very interesting quality to it. That being its every brick was made of gingerbread. It was upon a day quite delightful for making candy that our hero arrived at this kingdom. Our hero was unknown to many, but to those who knew him he was Peppernut, yet his dear parents called him Pfeffernusse. Upon entering the kingdom, he exclaimed that this was a delightful place to labor and make merry. It was this that he did for a long time. Due to his courage and spice, he had worked under the king and was even knighted. On one of his exploits, he saved Princess Gumdrop from a wild licorice. But within his soul, he felt quite peppered. This was because the castle's culture was being nibbled away. With all the safety that Pepper Knight, this was his new title, had brought to the table, it made the gingerbread community start to lose its ginger. This devastated Pepper Knight, for he saw his fellows turn to molasses cookies. He knew that they couldn't protect themselves in this state, and he was getting along in crumbs. He knew he must bring the ginger back to his people, but how? How would you do it? In the end, it seemed too hard. Maybe they never went back to their roots, and instead devoured themselves. So maybe you weren't expecting a fairy tale in a cookie video, but it was the best way to explain what I've noticed. In my study of different gingerbread recipes, I've observed that many don't even use ginger, which is insane. It's literally named gingerbread. But I also love making sourdough cookies, so I'm going to be making extremely spiced sourdough gingerbread cookies, decorated with peppercorns and candied ginger. As we begin the architecture for our cookies, it is important to note that although I'm mixing this by hand, it can very well be done by an electric mixer. With the story sketched out, let's turn our attention to the characters. 8 ounces of softened salted butter, half a cup of sugar, and 1/3 cup molasses. These figures become quite close and had a cloudy disposition after being exposed to a spoon. Afterwards, 2 Humpty Dumptys make a cameo, spacing their debut as to not overwhelm their hosts. Otherwise, if they had both jumped in, they would have curdled the group. It was about this time that a very cultured half cup of sourdough discard joined the party. He was very down to earth and had an equal heritage of wheat and rye, and his temperament had a good balance of wet and dry. He was joined also by 1 teaspoon of vanilla, and both of them readily joined the party. In the other kingdom of smaller bowl, there congregated the following fellows: 1½ tablespoons ginger, 2 teaspoons Ceylon cinnamon, 3/4 teaspoon baking soda, half a teaspoon nutmeg, 1/4 teaspoon cloves, 1/4 teaspoon mace, and a pinch of salt. Then half a teaspoon of each black peppercorns and allspice, as well as 1 cardamom pod, who had been ground fine before joining the rest. Then at last the final members arrived, those being 1/4 cup of pea protein and 2½ cups of all-purpose flour. After this party met together and became homogeneous, it went over and joined the butter's company. With all of the excitement, they needed a rest, and where better to rest than the fridge? They spent 30 minutes resting before adjoining in 20 separate parties. Each upon leaving receiving a gift of candied ginger and a peppercorn. However, all of them went the same direction, and they were quite relieved to be able to ride on greased baking trays. They traveled through a scorching desert where the temperature was always 350 degrees. But thankfully they could cool down after being in the desert for 15 minutes. In their experience, they had grown a bit crunchy, but still soft at heart. and they were quite thrilled to have received a beautiful golden suntan in the process. And now I have a few footnotes on this tale, which would be useful. 1. The butter and egg should always be room temp when baking cookies, unless a recipe specifically calls for otherwise. 2. The sourdough you use will affect the flavor, and most of the flavor is influenced by flour, water, environment, and age. For results closest to mine, feed your starter a mix of 2 parts white bread flour, 1 part rye flour, 1 part heritage whole wheat, and enough water to make it moist but not swampy. Also let it ferment a day or 2. 3. When you form the cookies, if you want them as little men, they will roll out nicely as long as the dough chills for a few hours. 4. The candied ginger may be incorporated in the dough or on top, if not both. Here concludes the footnotes. After all of our effort, we can now eat the harvest of our labors. I love all gingerbread, but this just hits different. The flavors are complex and nicely balanced. It's very strong. There's just so many flavor notes, and it's not too sweet, so it's not overpowered by them. I really like the crystallized ginger. It's not as spicy as you'd think it would be. It's really good. But they also go really well with a glass of kingly eggnog, so if you haven't seen that video, go check it out. I really hope this recipe can be of use to you this Christmas season. If this video was useful or entertaining, then subscribe and like it. That way more people can see it. Also, if you love all things ethereal, then check out my other socials for exclusive insight. But until next time, Merry Christmas and have fun baking. Ciao.